Hello, everyone, and welcome to Part 2 in the Foundation for the Advancement in Conservation's National Heritage Responders After the Fires webinar series, focusing on salvaging fire-damaged cultural heritage objects. The first webinar focused on health and safety in after-fire salvage operations, and the third focuses on book and paper materials. Both videos are also available on the AIC-FAIC YouTube channel. My name is Emily Trehu, and I will be presenting today with my colleague Megan Breakup-Narvi, but we'd like to give a big shout out to Malia Van Hoekelum and Pepper Youngs, who we collaborated with on this presentation. Just a quick note before we begin, access to this PowerPoint and a document with the links to the resources we mentioned throughout will be available through a QR code and tiny URL at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Now to begin, here is a brief overview of what we will cover in this video. We will walk you through the salvage process, but if things are already partway through that process in your own experience, just join in where you are and don't give up if you haven't matched exactly what we cover. This presentation is aimed at the needs of cultural heritage institutions, but the advice can be applied by anyone looking to save important family heirlooms or other fire-damaged materials. We'd also like to acknowledge that we are not on the ground where a fire has occurred and that salvage and recovery operations never take place in ideal conditions. But with this presentation, we hope to equip you with the basic knowledge and tools for salvaging cultural heritage objects that you would like to preserve until you can get them to a conservator for full assessment and treatment. It's important to remember that there's a difference between ideal practice and making whatever the best next decision is for you and your circumstances. And what we outline is an ideal path for institutions, which may not be practical depending on the size of your institution or for individuals, but the general principles can be adapted as you think best for your objects. Next slide, please. So, to start off with what to expect going into an area that's been damaged by fires, we're going to show some images from the aftermath of the fires on Maui in 2023 that illustrate that despite what can look like total devastation, there are still things that can be saved. So it's worthwhile to take the time to carefully plan and salvage your objects and your precious family heirlooms. Next slide, please. Hard materials like ceramics, stone, metals, shells, or ivory are likely to be salvageable in some state, though they may be structurally damaged, such as cracks within stone or only fragments remaining of an item composed of mixed materials like metal hardware from wooden furniture. Other damage in the form of melting, warping, discoloration, embrittlement, or cracking will depend on the type of material and the exposure to the fire. When you're sifting through debris like that in this picture, it can be difficult to distinguish between museum collection fragments and building debris, such as bricks and nails. But this photo shows some things that made it through the Maui fire. So in the left of this image, you can see the large bronze Buddha at the Lahaina Jodo Mission, which survived the fire along with two large bronze bells and their stone platforms. And the structure on the right made it through the fire still standing. That's the columbarium, which housed a number of ceramics, which were able to be salvaged. Next slide, please. On the other hand, organic materials like paper, wood, feathers, textiles, taxidermy, and synthetic things like film and digital collections are a likely risk of total loss through combustion. But this photograph of the wooden school sign shows how some unexpected materials can survive because of luck of location and other factors in the fire. Sometimes an object may survive because it was actually protected under layers of building materials, particularly in the case of things stored in basements. With cases less intact than this wooden sign in the picture, even if a surface is singed and likely won't be able to be restored, the structure of an object may still be intact, and it may still be an important object that can be packaged and saved. Even tiny fragments can be cleaned and have the potential for saving and framing in the future, but for that to be possible, they need to be well supported and aired out now. For areas that didn't burn, it's also important to remember that there are still other risks to be associated with the aftermath of a fire, including structural failure from high winds and mold from the water used to put out the fires or any rain that's occurred since. Next slide, please. The timeline to expect for the post-fire recovery will be a long process, and it will follow a path similar to the one outlined in this graphic. It is important to note that it only begins after permission has been granted by first responders and emergency services to access the affected area. The preparation stage includes careful assessment and planning before moving on to retrieval, and it's important to take the time to plan and gather supplies first. It may feel slow, but it will increase the chance of successful salvage of what you do find. These phases in this timeline together can take months or even years, and the full treatment of objects can extend well past that. For example, even with careful stabilization, the smoke smell can take more than a year to dissipate from an object that survived a fire. Next slide, please. These are some terms that we'll be using today. We'll be avoiding overly technical terms, but it's important to note, to begin with, the distinction between smoke, soot, and ash to be able to describe the concerns each pose for objects. Smoke is the combination of fine particulates and hot gases present with active heat. The gases and particulates can be absorbed into materials, leaving the smell of smoke and causing surface staining and chemical damage, even after the active heat is over. Soot refers to the fine carbon deposits remaining from organic materials that did not complete combustion, and those fine carbon deposits settle on surfaces. They can be either dry from organic materials or sticky and oily from synthetic materials, and it can be easily ground into surfaces through handling. So soot-affected objects should be handled as little as possible. It also can become more difficult to remove over time, especially if it's been exposed to moisture. Ash refers to the particles from incombustible materials that are left after a fire, and it can be acidic, abrasive, and toxic. So again, handling objects with ash should be kept to a minimum. Dissociation refers to the loss of data or identifying information about objects when they are removed from their context or separated from other identifying features without proper tracking and documentation. Following the steps that we outlined for first entry and retrieval with careful planning and documentation can help prevent dissociation from happening to help retain the specific identity data of the object and the history and knowledge associated with it. Porous versus non-porous refers to the surface of an object and will be an important determining factor for how to clean something. If it is porous, it means the surface is composed of minuscule holes or pores that are able to absorb moisture, trap debris, and retain odor. Something like stone or unglazed ceramic would be porous. A non-porous surface is something without pores. It's smoother and non-absorbent, and so it will be less affected by trapped debris and odor. So these are things like metals and glass. We'll be referring to objects as within these two categories later on in the stabilization section. The stabilization treatments we are referring to are steps you can take to stop ongoing damage or prevent continuing damage, but we'll not be going into full restoration or conservation treatments. We're just giving you how to stabilize the objects until they can be assessed and treated by a conservator. And finally, microclimates refers to enclosed packaging or storage solutions that allow you to create a controlled environment within them, such as to prevent moisture changes. Next slide, please. So now I will hand it over to Megan to go through first entry protocol.
Thank you, Emily. So to begin with, want to reiterate that this is the second presentation out of a series, and the first presentation is all about health and safety, and it is so important to be cautious and aware of your health and safety when you're at a like first response scene or like after any kind of fire. We're going to cover some of the basics in this presentation just to make sure that you have at least the basics, but I strongly recommend you go back and watch the entire health and safety video on YouTube. You can see it's only 20 minutes long, and gather all of the information that you need to stay safe. So it's very important when you're responding to a fire to stay observant and aware of your surroundings at all times when you're doing a recovery. So even though you're only entering a space, hopefully after the emergency response authorities have cleared the area for entry, it does not mean that that area is free of hazards. There can still be tripping hazards, sharp edges, broken glass, exposed materials like concrete and rebar, unstable structures that could still potentially collapse if you're moving things around. And of course, if it's rained at all, or if there is, water that was used to put out the fire, then it's possible that mold is growing or other standing water could have other kinds of contaminants in it. And remember that all of the buildings that are affected, like they typically have their own health and safety concerns, like lead paint or asbestos, and issues that we want to make sure that you're fully aware of the risks when you go in. In order to keep yourself safe, the thing that I recommend is to wear personal protective equipment. PPE should be worn at all times when you're on site doing object recovery, and even when you're dealing with objects after they've been retrieved from the site, because even after an object has been initially cleaned, it can still be covered in contaminants. Um, Even a basic cleaning, for example, isn't going to remove anything that's been absorbed into the material because of its porous nature. So, PPE will help keep you safe. And the kind of PPE that I recommend include reusable or disposable N95 respirators that are properly fitted, so you know they're really protecting your lungs. Um, Safety goggles, because you'll be kicking up dust and stuff. Disposable aprons or coats or Tyvek suits will help protect your clothing, and then you can remove it at the end of the day and not have to take it home with you. Nitrile gloves or work gloves also will help protect your hands from contaminants or sharp items. Hard hats, because you might be in a scene that is unstable, and then some first aid kit materials in case an accident happens, drinking water, hand sanitizer, and disinfectant wipes for, table surfaces and stuff like that. An example of why PPE is so important is that at high temperatures that you find within a fire, lead can melt, oxidize, and aerosolize so that it gets into the dust that can be on any surface. Similar hazards like that can also hang on in unexpected forms. So it's very good to be extra cautious. Ideally, the first entry into a site after a disaster is for assessment only, not for recovery or salvage. So this initial assessment is a great way to prepare yourself to make sure you have everything that you need when you go in for recovery, and set you up for success long term. So if you're able to start with an assessment, I highly recommend it. It should be performed by a limited initial group, and it's meant to identify what the remaining hazards are, establish the scope and goals of your operation before the whole team goes in. A lot of time, injuries happen in disasters because recovery and relief workers are working really hard during the salvage and recovery phase and not taking extra precautions to make sure they stay safe. So this first entry form to identify the existing risks and being extra careful about all of that stuff is super helpful. The assessment can also be used to determine salvage priorities. So you can create a priority scoring system to implement during the salvage phase. You can help simplify many difficult decisions about what to prioritize when you're working on salvage. A simple rapid collections assessment like the one available in the AIC Field Guide to Emergency Response, which is shown here on this slide, can help you to understand the scope of the salvage operation and help you objectively strategize recovery efforts. There's also a link to the overall AIC Field Guide for Emergency Response. Again, all of the links we'll share at the end, how to access them, and this is a really great resource. So when you are starting to actively respond, you do your first entry assessment, and then you continue your documentation all the way through the process until the outcome is finalized and every object is treated and resolved. Documentation is one of the most important things to prevent extra damage from happening and to keep track of things and make sure that nothing is getting missed or lost. So even if an object survived the initial disaster, it's still at a very high risk of loss without proper documentation because it's easy to lose things. It's easy to lose track of what it is or where you found it. And then if you don't know what it is or where you found it, then it loses all of its value and importance as a collections piece. So keeping track of the documentation all through the process is really, really important because everybody knows that after a disaster, it's chaotic and unorganized, and we're just trying to return a small amount of organization to what is a very chaotic situation. Clear and consistent documentation is also really important for like reporting to insurance or applying for funding through grant programs after the fire is over. Ideally, you'll create your documentation plan before you begin to retrieve objects. Some examples of a documentation plan can be creating a new tracking number system to be used specifically for your salvage operation, which should be short and easy to interpret. It could incorporate information on the initial location, the object and material type, or the room number, that sort of stuff. If you have multiple documentation teams, it's really important to make sure that they're not double numbering things or using the same number on different objects. So make sure you have a strategy to avoid confusion that way. You should think about creating a standardized inventory form to be used for every object and also include like the priority of salvage for that object when it's being documented. And make sure that everybody involved in the salvage is using your overall documentation plan, and everybody knows how to use it and is set up for success. I recommend documenting the condition of an entire area before a single object is moved and like make sure to take pictures of everything. We're so lucky that we have easy access to quality photographs on our cell phones nowadays, but you can also use, a more professional camera. But photos are easy to take and they're really powerful documentation tools for insurance, for applying for grants, for keeping track of things, for understanding later on what you were seeing, and what you were writing yourself notes about. Sometimes the combination of photos and written notes is the most helpful way to like recall things later. All right. During your salvage operation, you're going to want to have both a staging area and a temporary storage facility, and these are typically going to be different places. So your staging area is going to be on site, easy to access while you're doing your salvage operation. And it's going to be, safe and dry, structurally sound with good ventilation because we've mentioned the like smell of smoke is very present, and you want there to be good airflow to make sure that that is able to dissipate. Ideally, it will have some electrical power so that you can charge laptops and stuff, but that's not necessarily a crucial thing at that stage. Later on, you're going to want to have a temporary storage facility set up. This is going to be someplace that you take your objects after they've gone through initial documentation and maybe initial cleaning, and they've been packaged. They can go into the temporary storage facility, and it's going to be a place with temperature and humidity control, light control. There's not like a pest infestation there. Hopefully, it will have some good security. So, on site, you might not necessarily have 24/7 security or locked doors to protect your items, but once you get them to your temporary storage facility, you should be able to know that things are safe. And then a contractor use agreement for your storage facility if it's not a building that you own. Um, the picture shows, a temporary pop-up tent, which can be a good on-site staging area, but can also just be a table somewhere safe and away from the like worst conditions. Sorry. Okay. On this slide, we have a list of materials that we think are useful for retrieval, object stabilization, and object packaging. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these materials, but you can screenshot this page. You can take a look at the presentation. At the end, we have a link to the presentation so that you can go back and look at this. Some of the materials here are, sort of specialized conservation materials like Remay or Mylar. But a lot of it is just like basic materials that you can use, like garbage bags and duct tape and, tools like a screwdriver. So this is a great resource to like decide what you need for your particular situation and gather those supplies before you actually go in for your salvage. All right, now that I've covered that first response, I'm going to start talking about retrieval. So you've gathered your materials, you've fully assessed the scene, you're maybe ready to start searching for items that survived the fire. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk a bit about the retrieval process and how to keep yourself safe while also protecting any items that you find. Let's start by talking about your team. For every person that takes on searching the site for surviving artifacts, ideally somebody else is there to take notes. One person to handle the objects, one person to write down what was found and where, and what it looks like, and what condition it's in, and then maybe another person there just to take pictures. Detailed documentation and photographs will help later when you're trying to conserve items, when you're dealing with your insurance company, and it will help you later when you're trying to figure out what it is that you found. Again, take pictures before anything is moved so you have a visual memory of its location on site. And then you can also take more detailed pictures of what it looks like and what its like condition issues are. After the terrible fire that burned down the National Museum of Brazil, rescuers there discovered thousands of objects in the rubble, including the skull of Lucia, one of the earliest sets of human remains in the Americas, which was, their most important collection item that they had in that museum. It had been protected inside of a metal cabinet at the time of the fire. So it might surprise you what you can find after a fire, whether it has been completely devastating or, just a small fire. After a really devastating fire at Clarendon Park, which is a historic house in England, like some magical air pocket in the house, it managed to protect a massive 18th century state bed, and they were able to remove it to salvage it, including a silk headboard. So just because things look very bleak doesn't mean that things are all completely lost. So while you're searching for things, good places to find objects are going to be inside basements, inside cabinets, especially metal cabinets, or drawers that have withstood the fire. looking underneath caved-in elements that may have provided that pocket of protection, like at Clarendon Park. But remember to be extremely cautious for your own safety. Basements can offer really promising places to find items, but they're also difficult to access and very dangerous to enter. Please remember to always prioritize your own safety over anything else. Don't make any structural changes at your site without getting clearance from a safety authority, and definitely wear your personal protective equipment throughout the process. The retrieval process after a fire can be more like an archaeological dig than anything else. Things might not look familiar anymore. You might have to come up with a new way to name locations at your site. So archaeologists, when they're on a dig, they use a grid system to track location. You might find that that's easier than trying to write what room things were found in. Some things might be easy to find, like that large bronze Buddha that we talked about earlier, but it's likely that you'll also find other smaller things or fragments of things. So just like on an archaeological site, when you're digging through debris, it's helpful to use a sieve to distinguish between possible artifacts and then, bricks and other building material. I've seen some helpful looking pictures of people using window screens to sieve ash and rubble over a wheelbarrow, which seems really handy. It may be slow, but of course, it's important not to miss anything. Keep in mind that items probably don't look the same after a fire. In addition to being coated in soot, the extreme heat can also change the way things look, change the color, change the shape. Items may have also broken into smaller pieces. Safe handling during retrieval, and in some ways it's the same as any other time you're handling a museum collection or an item that's really precious to you. The first piece of advice here is to always wear your personal protective gear. This is going to help protect you from any possible hazardous residues and dusts present. Wear your nitrile gloves, wear your safety goggles, your N95s, and protect your clothing as well with some disposable coveralls or at least some washable lab coats or something like that. Tip number 2 is to handle objects as little as possible. Look without touching before you pick something up in order to identify where you want to pick it up from. Look for possible flaking or powdery surfaces. We've mentioned this, but if the object is porous or it has those tiny holes in it, every time you touch it, you'll drive soot further into the pores, making it more difficult to remove later. So the less you touch something, the better. Number 3 is to avoid areas of potential weakness when you're lifting objects. So don't lift something by the handles or another projecting area. These are often the weakest parts of the object. Ideally, you'll be able to lift it from the bottom, cradling it in your hands. Other good standard object handling techniques are important now too. So yeah, don't wear your big bulky jewelry, tie up your long hair, all of those things that you already know how to do. The 4th tip is to focus on one object at a time and its specific needs, like if it has flaking paint. This allows you to focus on the object and avoid accidents. And think out your whole route before you pick something up. So when you pick it up, you should already know exactly where you're going to put it down, so you have a whole plan. Tip number 5 is to ask for help. If the item is big, bulky, or awkward, get help with lifting it, and also make sure your path is clear so that you're not tripping over anything as you're carrying it. Even if you think you can manage it on your own, have someone walk beside you just in case so that they can step in if you need an extra hand or clear your path if something comes up that you weren't expecting. And finally, keep a designated object area, which is separate from your writing area with no pens or inks, separate from any food or drink. You should also, in general, food and drink should be kept a safe distance away from the salvage site, somewhere where you can access it safely without contaminating it. This is the overall trajectory of a move. So when you're picking up an object and moving it, Remember to only move objects when necessary to handle things as little as possible. We have to assume that after a fire, everything that we come across is going to be extra fragile, probably covered in ash or soot, and we don't want to damage it. So the less we touch it, the better. Before we move something, we've already planned our route and cleared out a path, cleared a place for the object to set it down when we're there. During the move, if possible, it's ideal to use trays or bins to carry objects rather than just our hands. You can cushion items with padding material. Padding can be whatever you have on hand. It doesn't have to be museum quality acid-free tissue paper. It can just be paper towels or rags, anything that you have access to. You can try to separate smaller items so they're not rubbing against each other. Uh, if you can, it's nice to use a box that can fit the entire object inside of it so nothing's sticking out the top, because that makes it, adds risk to things getting knocked around or damaged. And if you have something really big or heavy, don't push or drag it, but instead ask for help. Make sure that wherever you have moved things, they're placed in a way that they can be easily reached without disturbing other objects. And if damage has occurred during the move, record it now, because you want to know when the damage took place and how it happened. This is really important for keeping track of the timeline of each item. And just because something is damaged during the move, that doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. It's just, a sign of how fragile things are after a fire. When there are things that are too large to move, sometimes the best thing that you can do is just leave them in place and try to erect a temporary structure around them to protect them from the elements, to protect them from, construction crews that are going out and clearing away rubble after a fire. So these structures, like the plywood box that I have pictured here, they provide a double purpose of also communicating to construction workers that there's something important under the box. And you can also, write on it in spray paint or something. So plywood box is, a simple construction material to leave things in place on site, but there are other ways to do it as well. Just think about how to mark it and protect it so that it stays safe long-term on site. If you find anything with painted surfaces, you should try to keep these flat, as if you change the position of it, the paint might fall off because, paint might have become extra flaky after the fire or after water damage also. If you find a textile or anything sort of similar, something that would normally be kind of floppy, keep in mind that it might be a lot more brittle after the fire. Try not to fold or bend these materials because that could cause breakage. You can transport them on boards, or you can make slings for them out of cotton sheets. If you do need to fold them, make sure you pad out the folds really generously. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between dry, damp, and wet materials and how to deal with them. So I think that we probably understand what it means to be dry, but what is the difference between damp and wet? Basically, when we say wet, we mean it is fully saturated. Something is sitting in standing water. If it's not completely saturated with water, then we're going to call it damp, or would say dry. So a rule of thumb is to package objects and store objects in similar conditions to how they were found, or to slowly acclimate them to the conditions in which they will be stored. We're going to talk more about storage later, but first, if it's dry, obviously keep it dry. If it's damp, it's probably okay to slowly dry it out. Air drying is usually a good option in those situations. Set it out somewhere with absorbent materials that you can regularly swap out and make sure there's gently circulating air to prevent mold growth. This should work for most materials. But if you have any questions, it's always a good idea to talk to a conservator, and we will provide resources for that. If you find wet objects, the best thing to do is to consult with a conservator as soon as you can, because it really depends on the material type when you're trying to preserve these long term. Some materials can be safely dried, some might need to be kept wet until they can be seen by a specialist, and others can be safely frozen and then dealt with later. If you find wet materials, you can contact the National Heritage Responders Helpline. You can contact a local conservator. Again, we'll provide some resources on how to contact a local conservator. And in the meantime, you can keep things wet and store them in a cool, dark place until you're ready to talk to a conservator. Now I'm going to talk about triage and sorting what you found. So triage is really important so that you can focus your energy on the most important, the most vulnerable things, and the most valuable things that you've recovered. And when I say valuable, I don't necessarily mean like the most priceless items, but the most valuable to you or your organization for whatever reason. So if you found, the most historically important item in your collection, you're going to want to prioritize it above other things that you found. But similarly, if something is damp or wet, you're going to want to provide attention to it before something that's dry in order to prevent further damage from happening. So while you're in the process of triage, you'll also want to sort things to make them easier to stabilize and pack up for the next stage of recovery. So you can separate items that are wet, damp, and dry, separate items by material type to make them easier to pack and treat, but I recommend keeping associated materials together. So say you're generally separating things like stone is here, metals are here, textiles are here. Say you have an axe that's come apart and it has a metal part and a wood part. Even though those would go in different places, keep them together so you don't lose track of what they are and how they're connected. I want to reiterate how important documentation is. It is crucial to keep track of every item, the condition it's in, and what it looks like. Make sure that everything has an inventory number so you can track it, and make sure that different teams aren't double numbering things. Photograph everything from as many angles as you can, and in general, take the following notes. What is this item? Where was this item? Where is it going? And what are the main condition issues with it that you can identify? All right, now I'm gonna pass it back to Emily to talk some more about stabilization. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that she can do some hands-on demonstration for you.
Thanks, Megan. I'm just gonna turn my computer this way a bit so you'll be able to see both me and the screen behind me. So like Megan said, it's really important to wear your personal protective equipment throughout the process. So since I'm going to be handling some soot and ash damaged objects, I've got a lab coat on, but any sort of, overwear, anything that you can take off once you're away from the fire debris. I've got my protective goggles here. I'm wearing nitrile gloves, and I do have an N95. I'm not going to wear it for the recording because you wouldn't be able to hear me well. And I know what is in all of this soot and ash, and I know there aren't toxic materials, but again, after a wildfire or the like, you never know what's going to be in the ash, so you want to make sure that you've got your N95 or personal respirator. So just gonna go over here. All right, so I'm gonna start with some vacuuming techniques. And with your vacuum, you're gonna want to use the smallest nozzle attachment that you have for it. And you're gonna want to cover it with something like tulle, which is what I have on this. Any sort of mesh fabric, cheesecloth, something like that works well. And you can just place a layer over the top of the nozzle and secure it with something like duct tape or blue painter's tape. And the reason you want to do this is that as you're vacuuming, you want to make sure that any loose fragments that might come off the object don't accidentally get sucked into the vacuum. So this way you have a little barrier and you can stop every now and then and bag anything that came off the object so that when you do get it to a conservator in the future, you can give them all those pieces as well. So I'm going to demonstrate some vacuuming techniques for both porous and non-porous objects, starting with this little metal bowl. So it's metal, so I know it's not porous. What you're going to do is you want to hold the vacuum in one hand and then hold a soft brush in the other hand. And you hold the nozzle as close to the surface as you can without touching it, and just brush the soot or ash directly into the nozzle. That way you're helping to guide everything into the vacuum, and as little debris as possible will get airborne and possibly affect you. Now for a porous object, like if we start with this terracotta little figurine, you're not going to want to brush because you're just going to end up pushing that debris further into the pores. So you just hold the nozzle as close as you can over the object and just move back and forth until you stop seeing any change. One tip for vacuuming things where you can use a brush is that new makeup brushes are a really good tool. When they're brand new, they're really clean and really soft. You don't want to use something that you've used for makeup because then you'll risk transferring the makeup onto the object. But new makeup brushes, they come in all sorts of sizes, which can be really good for getting into little crevices. So that's just a little material tip. So now moving on, I'm going to talk about smoke sponge, which is also known as chemical sponge or soot sponge, and it's available from pretty much all hardware stores, a lot of places online. It's not very expensive. It looks like this. It's a vulcanized rubber that itself is a very good example of what a porous surface looks like. It's made up of lots of little pockets, which when rolled over a surface with debris or dirt or dust or anything, it gets caught up into the little pockets of the sponge and lifts it off the surface of the object. So to use it, you can cut it into smaller cubes. I tend to do sort of like 1" by 1/2 inch cubes. And I'm going to use this little wooden owl figurine that is very, very sooty and dusty. And I've got my little cube. And what you're going to do is just gently dab the surface or roll it along the surface. You don't want to rub or wipe it across the surface because, as I mentioned before, soot and ash can be very abrasive. So any, like pulling motion with pressure, you're going to risk scratching the surface of the object. But with the sponge, just softly dabbing it on the surface, and you can see as I go, the surface is becoming gray. So once your whole surface of sponge is gray, then you can just shift to another part of your little cube. And as you go, shifting to new parts of the cube until the whole thing is gray, and then you're just going to dispose of that. You can also, it's very easy to just cut with scissors. So you could cut it to create more clean surface, but anything that you've used on soot or ash, you're going to want to throw away again because of the possible toxins. Pin back there. Another thing with smoke sponge is that you want to be really careful or just avoid any pigmented or painted surfaces. If you have something that you think looks stable, like on this figurine, you can see he has some little blue painted areas. And I don't see any sign of lifting or flaking. So you can just do a little test with a clean corner. Just gently dab it on that area. But after the test, check the sponge. And if you see any sign of the color, the pigment coming up on the sponge, don't go any further. Just leave it until a conservator can look at it. For porous materials, anything that's not getting picked up by the smoke sponge, or anything like a plasticky soot residue or smoke staining, that is going to require a conservator. But for non-porous materials like metals, glass, or a glazed ceramic, you can try a little bit of wet cleaning. So for that, I've got a glazed tile here. Which has some ash and soot on it. And you're going to want to use a clean, lint-free cotton. So something like clean t-shirt rags, which are supplied by Uline, or something like Webro cotton pads. These are similar cotton pad, or any sort of medical rolled cotton you know is going to be clean and sterile for objects. So you just take your cotton pad, lightly dampen it. Deionized or distilled water is preferable, but oftentimes it's hard to access that. So just the cleanest water you have access to. A little squeeze bottle like this is a good way to make sure that you're not super saturating your cotton, just getting it a little damp. And then really gently dabbing the surface, picking up the ash. Again, you want to avoid rubbing. With the cotton, you do need to wipe a little bit, but as gently as possible so that you're not causing any abrasion. And you can see it's coming up on my cotton, and already that little corner is looking much brighter than the rest of the object. Another thing you can try is if you have access to some ethanol, a 50-50 blend of water and ethanol will help your moisture evaporate more quickly. So for things that are sensitive to moisture like metals, you could try doing that 50-50 ratio if you have access. And for metals, you really only want to do wet cleaning if the surface is a clean, stable metal surface. Any corroded or rough surface, you're going to want to skip the wet cleaning. So yeah, as you're going, as soon as the cotton starts looking dirty, you just move on to a clean bit of cotton, because again, that abrasive nature of soot and ash, you don't want to keep going once it's on the cotton. So I think those are the things I was gonna demonstrate. With wet cleaning as well, you just want to make sure that you allow everything to thoroughly dry before you move on to any packing. Megan, I think if you could share the screen again, and we can show the way to contact the conservator. I'm just going to slide over here again. So once you've tried those stabilization techniques, the careful vacuuming, the smoke sponge, and for non-porous surfaces, a light wet cleaning. For anything beyond that, again, so things like soot staining or a greasy, plasticky residue, you're going to want to contact a conservator. And the American Institute of Conservation has a very helpful online tool to find a conservator in your area. You can go by area or by material specialization, and that link will be available in the resource document we share at the end. Okay, next slide, please. So after you've done those simple stabilization cleaning techniques, you're gonna need to house your object until it can get to a conservator. So now I will talk about packing. So it's important to not think of packaging as an afterthought. It plays a really important role in deterring any continuing damage. Due to the extent of the recovery timeline, whatever you start your object off in as packaging, it's likely going to stay in that situation for longer than you expect. So if you start off with best practice packaging, then you're going to give your object the strongest likelihood of a good outcome. And the best chance of salvage for when that object can be individually addressed. On the slide are the 5 goals you want to try to hit for your packaging. You want to make sure that it's providing physical protection and facilitating safe transportation. So those both refer to providing adequate support and avoiding excessive handling. I'll talk a little bit about things you can do to provide a little degree of environmental control. If it's enclosed, it helps prevent any further dust and dirt accumulation. And keeping your packaging as simple yet efficient as possible is both easier on you and actually better for the objects. Next slide, please. So it's actually easier sometimes just to avoid the common problems rather than trying to hit specific benchmarks that might seem unattainable. So as long as you've avoided falling into these 8 traps, then your packaging will meet the 5 goals from the previous slide. So like Megan talked about during discussing sorting of objects, just keeping like materials together. So wood with wood, metals with metals. Number 2, you can address by making sure you have enough padding between the container and the object and between multiple objects if they're within the same container. You want to consider any loose or detachable components to the object or weak spots that might need extra support. Numbers 3 through 6 all relate to over packaging, killing with kindness, doing over engineering what you actually need. Preferably an object within an individual container that nothing will be hidden or accidentally crushed or hard to remove, which can sometimes happen if you're layering on too much packaging. With 0.7, making sure that every container is labeled. For a larger container that has multiple objects, making sure it has an inventory that's clearly on the lid, so that as soon as someone opens the box, they know what they should be looking for inside. And then with number 8, just making sure that the packing materials you're using are suitable for the objects, and we'll go over that on the next slide, please. So on this table, you can see some common materials that people often think of as, a first resort for packaging, things like rubber bands and tape. And then on the blue column, you've got some archival alternatives to those. A lot of the materials in the middle column can be chemically damaging to objects, particularly if they're enclosed within a sealed container or touching an object. And so as much as you can, avoid that middle column and replace it with things in the blue column. Every little bit helps for the objects. For the padding and support line, things like acid-free tissue paper that can be made into like a puff to support objects, or making little bean bags out of plain cotton filled with small glass beads and tied off with just a cotton string. That's another really good way to make a easily adaptable support for an object. For bags and boxes, I've included the plastic types that are most likely to be stable, polyethylene and polypropylene. But if you can't ensure that that's what the plastic of your box or bag is, the best rule of thumb is that anything that's been approved for food storage is likely going to be okay for your objects. Sealed plastic boxes are important for things that need a microclimate, like metals, but otherwise archival board boxes are okay, and can actually be better for allowing air exchange, and that long off-gassing process that things need with smoke damage. For larger items that need to be bagged, things like archival staples can be used to make large envelopes out of polyethylene sheeting, which, if the envelope is stapled around the edges, it's not fully enclosed, so it'll still allow for air circulation. Next slide, please. So we're just going to go through some examples of good packaging. So here for medium to large objects that are not metal, this is an example of, you've got the object, it's a ceramic vessel with a handle. It's clearly visible within that box as soon as the lid is taken off. It's supported all the way around. The handle is visible so that when someone's picking it up, they'll know not to lift it by that handle. Like Megan was saying, you can get your hands around the base to hold it where it's more secure. It looks like it's just packed with archival tissue. So this packaging would be easy, quick, efficient, inexpensive. And when the object's not traveling, you can take the lid off and it allows for the smoke odor to off gas. But for quick travel, you can just add another layer of tissue and a lid. You want to make sure that the object isn't higher than the edge of the box so that a lid can be added if you need to transport it. And then another thing you can do is when the container has to be closed, you can include air purifying materials to assist with the off-gassing. So things like activated charcoal or zeolites, both of which are easily available at pet stores because they're what is used for filters for litter boxes for cats. These materials often shed though. They'll leave sort of like a fine gray dust. So if you keep them in an open bag within the container, just to separate them from the object, they'll be able to still interact with the air within the container, but not shed any of their dust onto the object. Next slide, please. For small non-metal objects, individual bags separated by padding can be a good storage solution. If you have sort of like a thin layer of foam, like a Jiffy foam or Volara, that you cut to the shape of the bag, it makes it possible to sort of stack the bags upright in a box. And so you can have a clear label on one side, the foam, and then the object visible in the bag. Another option is to make recessed cutouts within a layer of archival foam within a box. You can easily add clear finger cutouts like in this image, which for things that have handling concerns, it makes it possible to indicate to the next person who opens this box where the best place to handle these objects is. This might be tricky if you don't have access to archival foam. But if you do, you just want to make sure your cutouts aren't too tight. And it's also a good way to fill the whole area of a box without losing track of objects within it. And you can also make layers of foam within one box. You can see in the corner of this image where the foam is cut at the corner. That's because that layer can be lifted out there, and there's another layer with objects underneath. In both these examples, so individual bags stood up within a container or this box with cutouts, you can just add another layer of acid-free tissue puffs and the lid, and it's ready for transport. Or you can keep it open for off-gassing while it's in storage. Okay, next slide, please. So for metal objects, it's really important that you only pack them if they are fully dry. Moisture is required for almost all corrosion processes. And so if you're packing an object while it still has moisture in it, you're going to just be packing it into a constant cycle of corrosion. The actual packing method is similar to smaller objects, like in the previous slide, but you're going to want to store everything within a sealable, airtight container and include a desiccant that can create a dry microclimate. Silica gel is what is usually used. It's also available from hardware stores, craft stores, Amazon, etc. It can come in pre-made sachets or loose. So if you have smaller containers and the pre-made sachets might be too big, you can pour the loose beads of silica gel into like a Ziploc bag and just make sure the bag is perforated so that there's still air exchange between the silica gel and the environment within the sealed container. For the containers, like I said before, food storage containers are really useful for this. They're usually a stable plastic. They're usually clear, so you can see what's inside the box, and you can see the silica gel within it. But you're going to want to make sure that you label the box with the date that you added the silica gel or when it was last changed. For large metal objects, if they're too big to be packed within an enclosed container, you're just going to want to make sure that you pad them as much as possible for transport with cushions, really large things. Sometimes a mattress is the best padding. And then you're just going to want to store them in as cool and dry a place as possible. If something is too large to move, you can just erect a temporary structure around it that can help protect it from rain. Next slide, please. For flat objects, such as textiles or leather or painted wood, you want to keep them horizontal. A good way to do this is using an archival cardboard, like acid-free card or board, that you cut to just larger than the object, so a few inches spare on all sides, and then covering it with a layer of unbleached brushed cotton creates a surface that the object won't slide against. That brushed cotton creates just enough friction to prevent things from slipping. You can secure the cotton around the board with archival staples, and then for things like textile fragments, you can hold them in place with a nylon netting layer, which can be tied with cotton twill tape. And this is another thing where you can include things like activated charcoal or zeolites made into a little sachet and placed around those extra edges of the board, just making sure you have a barrier layer with the object, something like tissue or cotton to prevent the dust from the zeolites getting onto the object. And for transport, you can just slide the whole board into a large poly envelope like we discussed before. Next slide, please. For wet storage, like Megan said, if something is found wet, you're going to want to keep it wet until it can be assessed. So for wet storage, there's really 3 points that you want to consider. If you've got multiple objects in the same bin, you can keep them in perforated plastic bags to keep component parts separate, or to keep multiple parts of an object together. You want to consider the weight of your containers when you have water in them. It's going to get pretty heavy pretty fast, so making sure that the containers are going to be manageable when they're filled, and making sure that you're not putting a full container of water on top of a box that doesn't have wet storage in it, because that weight could crush smaller boxes beneath it. And then anything that's in wet storage, you want to keep in as cool a storage area as possible to prevent any biological growth within the water. Next slide, please. And for transporting your objects, the main point in transporting is to allow buffer time before you open any container in a new space. It just allows the environment within the packaging to equilibrate with that of the environment within the new space. Making sure that you just take that time can protect your objects from any drastic changes in environment. So for the types of packaging that I've shown, again, just adding things like an extra layer of support or padding where needed, making sure that your lids get firmly attached and secured, packing according to weight and height when you're filling a truck. And then with everything we've talked about, the documentation, making sure that everything is labeled, you have clear signs like fragile when needed, and then giving things the buffer time when they get to their final location. Next slide, please. So as we've mentioned, a list of all the links that we've given throughout this presentation and a PDF version of this PowerPoint can be accessed at the QR code or tiny URL here. Megan, is there anything else you'd like to add?
There's also a tiny URL to visit the presentation online, which somehow didn't make it into this PowerPoint, even though I thought I added it. It's the same tinyurl.com/NHR objects presentation is the link. So that should.
And I think we've got another slide, again, just with some more resources that are available online, and they're also linked in the sheet. And then just a final thank you to many colleagues who contributed ideas and their experience to this presentation. So thank you so
Yes,
much.
and again, thank you to Malia and Pepper who helped us create this presentation, even though they didn't join us in this physical presentation.
And thanks to NHR for organizing this series. So I hope this helps, and good luck.